the University of Central Asia. We are very pleased to have for our 11th public lecture Lutfi Rahimi, who is a non-resident research fellow at the Afghanistan Research Initiative, ARI, and who has worked in promoting and developing the Biruni Institute, which was a good economics think tank in Afghanistan, and was taught at the American University of Afghanistan, and was a senior policy advisor to the Ministry of the Economy. And as discussant, we're very pleased to have Professor Michael Cox, who is a former chair of international relations at LSE. He is quite well known. He was a co-founder of LSE Ideas, which is one of the best university affiliated think tanks in the world. He has many visiting positions and publications, which I will not read out. But we're very happy to have such a distinguished person who will give the comments. And the topic is a very good one. It's called Institutional Continuity and Incremental Change, Models of Economic Development in Post-Intervention Societies. The focus is, of course, on Afghanistan, but I think the issues and the paradigms that Lutfi addresses, the models of development, have huge significance beyond Afghanistan. I'm in Ukraine now, and what is described by Lutfi in the context of Afghanistan certainly happened over here. And I think that this is a very good contribution to rethink the paradigms of development. And I will call upon Lutfi to start his presentation. Lutfi.
Thank you, Botan, and thank you for that kind introduction as well. So I will try to do this in roughly about 30 minutes, and hopefully we will have more time for discussion and questions and answers, where I would be looking forward to hearing more from others, as well as our discussant. Like you said, I've been interested in this topic for a while, and because it almost happened in my lifetime, although I started learning more about it professionally and academically much later. But when I went to Afghanistan in 2017 and then moved there full time in 2018, it wasn't the best decision. Every rational person I knew in the UK told me, "What are you doing?" But I thought I was making much of a contribution by being there, and I could tolerate the level of insecurity and problems that was going on at the time. It was a huge shock and a cultural shock as I learned more and went back into the as in delved into the system. So I've been interested in the topic since then. So this one is, the three clues are in the name. So without further ado, I'll just move on. So the actual question that I investigate in the paper itself is the importance of institutional continuity and understanding the society's expectations about the role of the state. So that's the entry point. And I do this in the context of Afghanistan, and I look at the 2001 intervention that happened at the turn of millennia, and I think it was one of the most important events of the century. It continued for almost about 20 years, cost a lot of money, a lot of lives, and ironically, it started by toppling the Taliban regime and then handed back the government to the Taliban 20 years later. So it makes it a worthwhile kind of event to study. Particularly, there are several things going on there in terms of the state design, but particularly I'm interested in the economic management frameworks and paradigms that happened starting 2001. And within the course of the 20 years or 21 years, there are several challenges that this new paradigm has, probably some more important than the question being discussed here in this paper, for example, in security or corruption or governance. But to fully understand the trajectory of economic performance, I think it is vital to understand this fundamental shift that kind of came with this new paradigm post 2001 about the role of the state and government in the economy. And this is particularly important in the context of Afghanistan, as I will discuss and allude to throughout the presentation, because of the strong background and the type of dynamics that existed within the context of Afghanistan. So that's the question that is being discussed in the paper. Couple of notes about or definitions before I move on. When I say institutions, I would like to clarify that a little bit further. What I mean by institutions is a particular definition of it within the institutional or new institutional economics, economic thought, particularly defined by Douglas North. So you have formal institutions that are codified laws and regulations, and then you have informal institutions that are unwritten norms and traditions and conventions rooted within the culture. So that's what I would be using the word institution to mean throughout this paper and the presentation. The other thing about the methodology that I've used, what I've tried to do in the presentation is stay away from huge theoretical discussions and discussion on the methodology. The paper is in the publication process, and you can read more on that. But the methods I've used is a review of the source material that happened in the 20 years of the Republic, starting from 2001 all the way to 2021, and some very hard to reach publications and rare sources in Afghanistan prior to that period. So starting from 1956, so I begin and I make the case later on that from 1956 there is a formalization period that takes place, and I look at publications and data from that period onwards. And then in order to understand the expectations of the people and the societal expectations about the role of the state and the role of these legacy institutions, I do kind of a structured interviews with experts who have worked in the Republic government, who are academics and who have worked with international financial institutions and so on, to better understand how they felt about the topic. So in terms of literature review, this type of economic management framework is kind of a frequent occurrence post World War II or post neoliberal triumph in the 1970s. It's like a global trend where all international interventions end up adopting this universalist kind of market-led approach wherever this intervention takes place. And Afghanistan is no exception. And what I do is I review 3 official sources in the early 2001 and 2 and 3 and all the way to 2006 from the 3 different official sources. One, all the publications from the Afghan state, from the World Bank, and from the IMF, who were very, very directly involved. There are a lot of other bilateral agencies like USAID and so on. I think those views are reflected within the World Bank and IMF. So I look at these 3 official sources. Once you look at that, and then you kind of try to reconstruct the core tenets of the development framework that happened post 2001, you get three pillars of it. Number 1 is the enabler state function. That is that the role of the state is regulator, facilitator and enabler, and therefore defines the market-led approach. Complementary to that is private sector is identified as the engine for growth, and official development assistance is there to finance this process, this new state apparatus that doesn't have taxes. So that third tenet of the economic development framework is a temporary one, with the idea that slowly domestic firms and markets would pick up, and then they would generate taxes, and that would slowly replace the need for external finances. And that's how you reach a long-term sustainable market-dominated world. And this framework is very much designed in the image of a current Western world, so that of the UK or the US or different variations of it. But it's a very it envisages this world that we are in the so-called first world, as we were discussing the terms earlier on, or the more highly developed or advanced economies. So this is the framework that is designed for Afghanistan as well in 2021. And what I do is I begin to question and problematize, let's say, two of these core tenets. The first one is the enabler state, and the second is the private sector as engine for growth. My contention in the paper is not to reject this framework. I mean, I'm not saying we should abandon this completely and then move to a centrally planned economy or some other type. I think the core question is to see how this makes sense contextually in different countries and different contexts. So I use the word enabler state very carefully, because there are other words that are used to describe this. For example, the minimalist state is another term that you can find from the 1997 World Bank paper going onward, and in academic papers as well. But that is a misnomer, because the state does so much in these countries under the market-led approach. So you're not saying that the state doesn't do much, but it's what kind of things that the state does is what I'm trying to capture with the word enabler state. The other thing that I find reviewing the source material from the early documents that are there from these three official sources, going all the way to 2006, which is the period which I've consider as the formation period of this market-led model that started in late 2001 and early 2002. All the way to 2006, when you read all of these reports and all of the frameworks and the key documents from three different sources, what you find out is, number one, there isn't a single debate, national debate or forum, which brings the people that you're trying to create an economic management framework for, the private sector, and bring them together and then sit down with them and say, what kind of economic model should we have moving forward? There is no evidence of such a debate taking place regionally, provincially, or nationally in Afghanistan. And the word markets are very confusing as well. I want to make a comment about the word market in the context of Afghanistan, because there in 2001 and 2002 and 2003, you're talking about very, very early primitive types of markets that aren't doing very sophisticated things. But nonetheless, there are these informal institutions that rules that exist within the structure and the fabric of these markets and the society that people are very well aware of, and they know how they're doing this. So there is no debate that takes place on the development. The other thing that I find within these early key documents is that there isn't any institutional analysis of the prior periods. What you actually find is a very oversimplified reductionist view of the past, which is limited to the war economy period. And that's between the years of 1992 to 2001. So what I do is I list 30 different reports from the three official sources, and then each of their first chapter, what they have is a context or background. And what I do is I do a textual analysis, a semantic analysis of what do they say about the past. And what you find is they predominantly talk about the last 8 years or 9 years. And there they dedicate less than half a page and sometimes one paragraph describing the past and the institutions that govern Afghanistan's context. And what seems to describe what the Afghan context really means is sometimes simplified and reduced to one paragraph. There's a joke I made with a friend earlier, because there is a saying in Afghanistan that a lot of people are familiar. If you're from Afghanistan, they say the country has 5,000 years of history. So I kept saying the 5,000 years of history was reduced to one paragraph in all of these documents. Certainly on the institutional analysis level, there is very, very little discussion and little interest. And the other thing that I find is that there is this externally kind of influenced and aspiration by donors to adopt the market-led approach, and that's a consensus and that's a given, and there isn't a single question that is being asked. I mean, I avoid using the word agenda on purpose because I don't think there was malicious intention there to do something, to crowd out certain things. I think the structure, the market-led approach, the paradigm or the framework was adopted with the best intentions and aspirations, and they actually wanted the Afghan economy to leap forward and to reach new trajectories. So those are the couple of things that I find on the early sources. Just to add on the literature review bit, that there are people who do criticize this as early as 2005 and 2006, and there are papers that have been written lately as well, who look at various aspects of this framework and question how it is antagonizing the system or the domestic agency or local solutions. For example, there's a paper that looks at rapid economic liberalization and the IFI's kind of increases poverty and inequality, or reliance on external finances, or ODA creates dependency by design, which was another paper that was presented by and supported by ARI. Earlier on in 2008, and in LSE, colleagues have done a lot on this as well, where poor understanding of local dynamics kind of reinforces these parallel structures and reduces, for example, linking development to military kind of reduces its effectiveness and crowds out domestic solutions. So there are some critics. So the paper kind of builds on top of this and looks at the institutional discontinuity. In terms of the theory, what I do is I'll just touch on it a little bit and hopefully not dwell here too much, as I would like to talk about the context that we are discussing. So essentially, there's a spectrum when you look at this theoretically in terms of institutional evolution and change. On the one hand, you have people who say there is path dependency, that once you create and sediment certain types of institutions, and you set on an economic trajectory, these institutions are very, very dependent and they're very sticky, and they're very it's very difficult to escape from their effects. So therefore, whatever kind of growth and development you experience is dependent on that path that you begin. On the other hand, you have critical juncture theories, where they say that certain periods of times you have these new junctures where institutions are turned upside down, and you get new kind of beginnings and new opportunities. So there you can change and shift. And then theoretically, this is actually brought together in various models. Punctuated equilibrium model is one that combines both path dependency and critical juncture discussions, and says that much later in 2004, what I use as a theoretical foundation of the paper is a paper by Catherine Tellen on endogenous incremental change. I think what they discuss here is a kind of critique of the earlier models, saying that those are too deterministic. And what you really need to understand is this idea of incremental evolution of institutions internally and gradually, rather than this discontinuous break from the past. So when you design a new system. So in terms of the economic management paradigm within the Afghanistan context in 2001, the incremental approach or incremental change approach would say, do not abandon all of the previous institutions as obsolete and as useless and as communist, and move on. That would be the thing. And what I do is I take this theoretical kind of view, and then I look at the very famous successful economic models that are being discussed in the literature, in the development literature, frequently. So usually you have the East Asian tigers, that is Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, and Singapore, and then Eastern Europe, and then Latin America. So these are the blocks where you talk about the variations of different economic models with different degrees of success. And what I do is I try to trace institutional continuity in the pre-transition and the post-transition period, and other factors that existed within these successful economic models. So what I do is I create a table, like a matrix of these countries. I mean, the matrix was much bigger, so I tried to zoom in, and then at the expense of getting rid of Eastern Europe and Latin America and a bit of South Korea. But I think it makes the point that I'm trying to make in the paper, that what I have here is a list of different features or components of the economy. So, for example, the industrial structure, state control, land reform, innovation strategy, export strategy, role of state-owned enterprises, macroeconomic stability, education and human capital, security during transition, and some key weaknesses. So what I do is I look at the Japanese model of development, which kind of by Johnson in 1982, the term developmental state was coined and kind of became very popularized. And then I look at Taiwan and look at South Korea and Latin Americans, Eastern Europe is much more generalized, but I think it makes the point. So what you get is a feel of the pre-transition, post-transition in these models or in these economies. In the case of Japan, the US occupation, post-World War II, the US occupation happens, and then this explosion into market-led approach or model is implemented. But when you actually scratch the surface and then look at this different institutions and the role of different institutions, you realize that there is a lot of continuity in the case of Japan. Obviously, each of these models are very, very unique, and you cannot compare like by like in these cases. But I think the point I'm trying to make is the role of the state and the fact that there was institutional continuity in the pre-transition and post-transition. So, for example, in the industrial structure, in the market-led model of the Japanese world, you have these Keretsu, meaning large informal family-owned businesses who kind of own banks, supply chains, and so on. Prior to that was Zaibatsu, which was much more formal, and it was formalized, and they actually existed. When the transition to market takes place, what happens is that this continues informally. So there isn't this clean slate argument or clean break where you kind of completely destroy these industries that existed and then start anew, or rely on a number of new institutions literally spring up with the intervention itself. So in terms of the state control, for example, the industrial targeting and Ministry of Industries and Trade that led the strategy. What is interesting is that when you look at this MITI, the ministry that is very famous in the Japanese model, there is a ministry prior to the transition that is the Ministry of Commerce and Trade, with a very similar mandate, who was actually responsible for much of the industrialization of the Japanese economy prior to the market-led model. So what happens is that the new ministry comes along with a very similar objective, with a different name but similar institutions, and continues with an industrial targeting and strategy, which is a continuation, slightly different, but continuation of the pre-transition era. And you have a whole list of other features that you look at, and you could do this for Taiwan, you can do this for South Korea, and there are a lot of similarities in both these phases of these, where the state plays a huge role and institutions continue to survive and continue to nourish in the market-led world. So what I do is I create a very similar matrix in the case of Afghanistan, and I look at different periods of Afghanistan, beginning from 1956 all the way to 2021. And I break this down, and again, the table is too big, and if I were to fit the whole table in the same page, we'll not be able to read it. But the last one that is missing is the market-led economy, which I've been talking about, and I will continue talking about as well. So what I do is I divide the period between 1956 until 2021 into 4 different economic models. So there is the state-led model of 1956 to 1977. Then there's a centrally planned economy of 1978 to 1992. And then there is the war and drug economy of 1992 to 2001. And then you get the market-led economy that we are discussing right now. And if you can compare these across these dimensions, including state control, export strategy, and so on, you find that there are institutions, there are practices, there are dynamics that are sedimented within Afghanistan that are hugely important. And for example, and the reason why I picked 1956 is because that's when, and that's true globally as well, that most countries like India and so on, all of them, they start devising these 5-year economic plans and then they try to follow it. So that's true in the case of Afghanistan as well. In 1956, Afghanistan devises its first 5 economic year plan, and then the second economic year plan, and then the third and the fourth isn't fully implemented. But then the coup happens, and then the centrally planned economy comes along, which kind of bloats the state way further and then takes over and nationalizes the number of private sector firms that were developed under the state-led model. So if you take a look at the, and the reason why I kind of start with the 1956 as a formalization period, because prior to that, we do have the state that is involved in the economy as well. but it's not as formalized and as kind of written institutionally speaking. So when this state-led model in 1956 kind of starts accepting aid from both the USSR and the US and Germany, actually, so the three countries that give the most amount of aid during that period, new institutions are built inside of Afghanistan. New ministries are come together. There are new mandates, and these are expanded mandates. There is a huge industrial policy, there's state support, there are a number of SEOs that are created, there are a number of private sector firms that are created, and so on. And when you look at that lens of state control, the role of the state, the expectation of the people from the state, what I do is when I interview people about the role of the state in the economy for the paper, you find out that a lot of the expectations and a lot of the kind of understanding of what the state should do in the context of a market in Afghanistan comes from that previous periods, starting from 1956. You speak to all any Afghan citizen anywhere, they would say, "Oh, there was the heydays that we had cement production," and a bit like what Trump is doing in the US right now. Or we had cement production, we had this, we had gas, we had these good old industries, and the Republic in 2021, all the way to in 2001 to 2021, they spent billions and billions. They haven't resurrected a single one of them. Obviously, the nitty-gritty of the discussion is much more complicated. You have these competitions, you have other factors that may not be profitable if you start producing shoes inside Afghanistan, because it might cost you 300 Afghanis, and then you can buy something imported from China for 60 Afghanis. But that's not the discussion in the paper. The discussion in the paper that I have is that the expectations, what I call entrenched expectations, these entrenched expectations about the role of the state in the economy is what was formalized and kind of reached its peak under the centrally planned economy. Because a lot of people talk about the state should do this, the state should do that, and so on and so forth. Whether that is correct or not is a completely different question. However, it has huge implications for the kind of model and paradigm you begin to implement in the country, because what you do is you create this alignment or misalignment of expectations about what your state should do for you. So I do this comparison, and to just summarize it, in the pre-2001 transition kind of institutions, and again, referring back to the definition of an institution, as I pointed out earlier on, you get a number of different commonalities that exists. And these institutions are very, very entrenched across these periods and models. And people in Afghanistan expect the state to do something along these lines. For example, the state was the implementer. The economy was dominated by state-owned enterprises and state-owned corporations. These are institutions that are ingrained in expectations, but also ingrained in the bureaucracy of the state that was resurrected in 2001. Private sector is very weak. For example, in the paper, I draw from data on the development framework, the economic development plans of 1956 and subsequent plans. There are 4 of them. You find out that the contribution of the private sector is 0 in the first one, and then it's 2% or 4%, and then it goes to 0.2%. And then once you get to the centrally planned economy, then they're all nationalized. So therefore, the private sector does not exist in the sense that we understand it here in the West. So when you get to the 2001 intervention, people talk about the private sector as if the private sector exists there, conditional on the fact that the state should stay uninvolved. Anyways, so what happens is that during the war and drug economy period, this is the period that influences much of the thinking for the 2001 intervention period, is there is a lot of monopolies, and there's a lot of corruption, and there is a highly controlled trade and markets under a proto-state-like system, which resembles the previous periods. The proto-states, the different militia groups that are controlling different parts of Afghanistan, they control trade very, very tightly. And they do it through businessmen who have networks, and they don't have the political baggage, so they can travel and so on. You have monopoly rights. There are gemstone mines, there are different resources and minerals. These smaller groups, they impose monopoly rights. So these institutions are very common to the previous ones, to the state-led and to the centrally planned economy periods. Once you move into the market economy period, then there is a break. All of these things break down. So we bring in the market structure. A couple of other things. In large informal economy, there are various types of institutions, of credit provision, risk management, and so on. And there is a very underdeveloped financial market. So these are the pre-2001 institutions. Now I can move on to the discussions on the interviews that I did, which is to get an understanding of what experts felt about these enduring legacies and institutions. So what I do is I interview 24 people, and when you do what I do is these are the themes that emerge. And what this table shows is the number of participants who talk about the percentage of participants. This is not actually percentage. It should be the number of participants talking about each theme and the number of references that they make to each theme. So the dominant themes are developmental state, enduring constraints, local solutions, donor-driven agenda, decentralized economics and politics, corruption, and insecurity. So I'm not going to talk about all of them. I'll talk about the first three a little bit, and to just give you an idea of what percentage of these hierarchy graphs basically shows what percentage of people talked about which topic. So in the sense, I think these graphs are missing labels as well, because it was very difficult to fit them in these slides. So we have enduring constraints, which is directly linked to the topic of discussion here. And that is that we have these institutions and these expectations and these legacy institutions that exists within the formal and informal sectors of Afghanistan. And crowding them out and overriding them is not a good idea. So what it causes is misalignment, it causes policy misalignment, it creates poor institutions, and it antagonizes this domestic thinking. Because at the end of the day, ODA and external financing continues up until a point, and then it's the Afghans who needs to take ownership and then move on. So when you have something that you don't really know, for example, one of the things that I discuss in the paper a lot is procurement mechanisms. I mean, market-based procurement mechanism and market-based price signaling is two alien concepts in the context of Afghanistan. Throughout the 1956 all the way to 2002, you never have auctions and bidding and procurement that allows different people to come and bid and then win contracts. And what happens is that is implemented straight away once the new framework comes in. Anyway, there are discussions on development state and local solutions and various aspects. There is expectation that we should have a developmental state style where the government would be intervening in various bits of the market because we have a weak private sector, because the private sector doesn't have a lot of capital. So in order to kickstart this process of capital formation, you need the state as a very strong player in different bits of the market, strategically with targeted investments, with targeted investments in human capital, trying to adopt various protection mechanisms to allow these markets to these domestic firms to stand up and be able to compete at a regional stage or even at a domestic stage. I want to end with the last slide. That what I find is that there are dirigist practices started with the state-led model formalized in 1956, and it kind of peaked all the way to the centrally planned period and eventually kind of sedimented by 2001. So I do not agree with the argument that the Civil War period, the 1992 to 2001 period, is a period of breakdown. Because what happens there is you have this central state and the state-owned enterprises ceasing to operate in the urban areas or in the formal economy. What you have is a large informal economy that has a huge number of institutions within it that have stood the test of time, that have existed, and that exists in Afghanistan. So to make an argument that there is a breakdown of all the institutions, and in 2001 we have a clean break and a clean slate that we can build new paradigms and bring in new things, I think it's a reduction and oversimplification of a much complicated context. Then there are strong commonalities and similarities between the centrally planned economy and the war and drug economy period, which I kind of identify as distinct periods. For example, monopolies, proto-state control, sponsor trade, all of these under the war and drug economy period, the Civil War period, resembles those of the previous, hinting a continuity in the institutions. So what happens is when we arrive to 2001, the new framework and the new paradigm adopts this view that everything is broken down. There is a report, for example, by the Afghan state, one of the key documents, I think it's one of the earlier versions of the National Development Framework, the NDF, I think produced in maybe in 2002 or 3. It says destruction of human capital, destruction of the economy, destruction of private sector, destruction of this, destruction of that. So you find these when they talk about the past, and they're particularly referring to the 1992 to 2001 period. And I think that's a very, very simplified, narrowed, and reductionist approach to look at the past. The past and the context of Afghanistan is much wider and much bigger. And as a result of doing that, we create this dual misalignment in terms of institutions and the societal expectation of the state and what we should do within the economic management realm. And this leads to this suboptimal performance. Alternatively, I think an incremental approach. One other thing to mention, I forgot, for example, in the 2023, there is a committee that is formed to sell all of the state-owned enterprises. So there is a sale of state-owned enterprises and some critiques of that, this approach. And the head of the committee is a guy who studied in East Germany, who is influenced a lot by the leftist thinking, who actually thinks this is a very bad idea we're doing, but he's put in charge of, auctioning the state-owned enterprises. Anyway, so all of these misalignments create this suboptimal performance, and I think, and as an alternative approach, an incremental change with a developmental state model where the state would do much more, targeted in a targeted manner, would have reduced some of the challenges ahead of the paradigm. If we were to again to do this again in a post, I think this is general comment and my final comment. If we were to do this in another post-internationalized intervention context, whether it's Afghanistan or not, an incremental approach would result in a more optimal performance. This is to, again, caveat this discussion that there are other factors that are also important, such as insecurity or corruption and so on. Yeah, that's it for
me. Thank you, Lutfi. Dr. Cox?
Well, thanks, Lutfi, for that presentation, and congratulations on exploring an area which often gets lost in the whole debate about Afghanistan, because there's been always so much focus on security and on the war itself. And so I think it's great that you kind of focused on something which often gets lost because of the great focus on the war, the ongoing war, the final withdrawal of the United States, and what has happened since. So yours is almost like a what if kind of story, you know, the counterfactual. And there's nothing wrong with doing that. And I think going back and thinking what might have been done differently might have led, as you point out, to very different outcomes. And I think that's an entirely legitimate exercise. Your story, you mentioned about 5,000 years of Afghan history. I won't go right back into that, but maybe go back a little bit into the history of Western economic thought over the last 50 odd years. And where do these ideas come from that you say had suboptimal consequences for Afghanistan? And in a way, the ideas you're talking about really go, I kind of put it in 3 stages. Again, providing some kind of background, context to what you're saying. One, it goes back to the 1970s, doesn't it? It goes back to that moment when Western governments, the IMF and others, begin to think that Keynesianism is no longer the solution. Indeed, Keynesianism in some way or another is the problem. And I always thought there was a wonderful moment in all this, the award of the Nobel Prize in Economics. One of the first, of course, went to Friedrich Hayek. And you mentioned the LSE, I see in passing there, but of course Hayek was at the LSE for many years until he went to Chicago. So that's an important moment of transition in the debate. And of course, it has enormous influence on economic thinking and on policy formation, all of which I think, you know, comes out in Afghanistan and in many other countries as well later on. The second moment, of course, is what is often called rather too easily the Reagan-Thatcher economic revolution of the 80s, which embeds certain kind of economic practices in dominant Western countries, even including then the UK, because Thatcher wasn't just a British phenomenon, she was an international phenomenon. After all, she had enormous influence in large countries in Eastern Europe, certainly in Poland and elsewhere, as Bogdan knows. And that again embedded the idea that markets were the solution. Market, you know, whatever the price of going for the market would be, in the end, you would arrive, as Hayek has always said, you would always arrive at an optimal conclusion, even though there'd be a high price to pay in the interim. Nobody denied there would be a price to pay for arriving at the market. And then the third moment in this kind of arrival at where you begin your story in Afghanistan, of course, is the end of the Cold War. And, you know, the idea that the end of the Cold War is a victory for the market or defeat for planning and the rejection of that. And markets work better. Government is the problem. And doesn't the collapse of what is called communism by some, doesn't that show that the market works? And therefore, we've got to go for a universal model of the market. Privatization, which had been practiced under Thatcher, an acceptance that you don't want to run subsidized industries because that's inefficient, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It becomes, as you point out, a kind of universal model, and to which it's very difficult to make opposition. You know, Keynes is dead. Keynesianism is now old-fashioned. Mrs. Thatcher and Ronald Reagan have shown that privatization works. And indeed, the end of the Cold War shows that planning fails. So it's not surprising. And of course, all this was applied long before we get to Afghanistan in the period you're talking about. Yeah, you could say that Poland led the way. You know, the shock therapy of Balcerovich. It was certainly applied in post-USSR, which Bogdan knows a lot about, with consequences we could talk about. And of course, it wasn't so surprising that after 9/11, when essentially the United States, supported by a number of others, intervene into Afghanistan. And their first priority, of course, is to deal, quote unquote, with Al-Qaeda, to deal with the Taliban. But as you start bringing out, what they also applied was as a broad model which you believe, and it makes a lot of sense to me, and I think the way you present the argument is very credible, simply didn't quite fit. Didn't quite fit the history of economic policy in Afghanistan, didn't fit the realities of Afghanistan. And only drawing from that one simplified market model, call it market fundamentalism if you want, had all sorts of downside consequences. And I think anything you say there, it seems to me self-evident. It didn't fit. And indeed, you might make a larger generalization. It didn't fit quite a lot of other countries as well. You know, I mean, when we went through the 1998 Asia financial crisis, the IMF stepped in with a certain model of how to get out of the crisis, and most of Southeast Asia rejected it because the cost of doing so was so traumatic. So what you're talking about in Afghanistan, it seems to me, has much wider application and raises all sorts of problems about transitions, so-called transitions, in other parts of the world. I suppose I'd raise two or three quick questions, not by way of criticism, but simply by way of enlarging the debate. One is, are you suggesting that it failed completely? I'm not sure you are. Because if you kind of take some indicators, and it may not be because of privatization, it may be because simply so much economic aid went into Afghanistan. I mean, that's one thing we need to discuss more of, the degree to which Afghanistan itself become totally dependent, really, on external economic aid, whether that was economic aid or military aid. But if you kind of look at certain indicators, and I bring that out in the book I edited on Afghanistan with LSE Press couple of years ago, and authors in that book bring it. Actually, there were gains, there were economic gains, which maybe need to be incorporated into your analysis. That's the only thing I'd say. Now, why those economic gains came about, you would know more about than I would. But the figures I've got, and I've taken again from the book I edited on Afghanistan with LSE Press a couple of years ago, by one or two LSE economists, I'm sure you know them, is that GDP, for instance, per capita, actually between the years 2000, 2001, 2009, actually went up from about $320 to about $550. And now, did that happen because of privatization, or did it happen because there's very large amounts of aid? Can we even believe those figures? I mean, I don't know, but I just wondered what you kind of say to those people who want to make a case. After all, we always want to think of the alternative to what we're saying in terms of the counter arguments. Were there certain gains that were made, even in spite of the application of a model which you didn't think is applicable? And why were those gains made? The other part of the gains, if you like, and it's difficult to talk about the gains now, 20 odd years on, I know, because of the situation as it's unfolded in Afghanistan, and nobody wants to talk about that. But I think we need to, basically in education as well. Now, this may have been largely, as again, others have written, this is largely an urban phenomenon, maybe less a rural phenomenon. But again, if you look at education, at least to the primary level of schools, which affected not only boys, but also affected girls, then again, there are gains that were made in the process of the occupation. So I suppose the first thing I'd raise really with you, and just to kind of think about really, is are there things we need to talk about which could actually provide a more positive spin? That's all, in terms of the analysis that you provide, and maybe those gains were not made because of the application of a universal model. It may have been happening simply because of vast amounts of economic aid that went into Afghanistan. And of course, that brings me then to a second point. Do you want to say more in your paper about the role of aid? Because many of the things I've read about, I'm not a specialist on Afghanistan, but many of the things, that Afghanistan became almost aid dependent, through the World Bank and through other institutions. And that in itself became the problem as much as the temporary solution, because you become so dependent on aid, you can make all sorts of mistakes in terms of economic policy. But if you've got so much aid flooding in, it's a kind of patch. It's a kind of, you can throw a patch over the whole thing. It may be going completely belly up on the ground, But if you keep pouring enough aid in, keep paying off enough officials, you know, keep building enough schools and bridges, as was being done in Afghanistan, building more and more schools. Kabul, I was told by people who were there at the time, was actually quite economically vibrant during this period as a result of the war, and the spending that went in, and inevitably so. But what happens when that aid is withdrawn? And that seems to me is a much larger question. So it may not be therefore focused purely on the model that you talk about it. What happens when you go into a country? And it's not going to happen again for a long time, I think, particularly now Trump is in power. But what happens when you get so dependent on aid, and what happens when that aid is removed? You know, you get the kind of economic collapse, which I think we've been seeing. You could talk about that more. The third and final point I'd make is you use all sorts of other analogies with other parts of the world, you know, the East Asia tiger models, things like that. But in the end, and I'd like to see how you deal with this, a lot of people would say you're never going to get proper economic policies when there's a war going on. You know, I mean, there is a war goes on and on and on. The Taliban are very successful in fighting that war with support from outside actors, as we well know. So to what degree can you implement what you would call better economic policies when the priority is to build up your security, build up your apparatus, fight the war against the Taliban for fear that Al-Qaeda may come back again? In other words, you kind of talk a lot about the economics. I just wonder if you do need also in the paper, again, which I very much enjoy, much food for thought there. How can you talk about the economy when you kind of partly leave out the debate about an ongoing and pretty bloody conflict going on? I'd also add one final historical point, which Bogdan and I would have talked about many years ago. How much of this really, in the end, goes back to what happened in December 1979, Bogdan? The Soviet intervention itself. How much of a legacy did that leave? And I know that's not part of what you were trying to do, but it's also, it is implicitly a part of the story, is it not? Now, the legacy of that long, bloody 79, 89 intervention, what sort of legacy did that leave, which made coming to some kind of rational, fair solution for the peoples of Afghanistan it also very, very difficult indeed? Maybe bring that larger historical perspective in. But again,
Good.
thanks very much, and much enjoyed the paper.
Thanks, Mick. Lutfi, you have 3 minutes to respond. You don't have to respond because but you know, like, what are the things? Well, respond as best you can, but these are really things that you should take on board because people reading your article will invariably ask these kinds of questions.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for these comments. Obviously, I will take them forward. Just wanted to add, you know, when you mentioned the Nobel Prize to Hayek, it was a shared Nobel Prize with Myrtle Gunner, which is completely the other side of the spectrum. But I think you kind of answered the Thatcher-Reagan and the end of Cold War as the winning story. If something had gone slightly differently, then we would have a Myrtle to criticize. Anyway, I agree with the point that it is difficult to do a counterfactual a what-if question and do that empirically because of the nature of the question. That's why I think I raised the point about insecurity and corruption, particularly those two that are very, very important in my view. But there's a certain window that late 2001 to 2006, we don't have insecurity and we don't have corruption. Although it's not a very long period, it's a period of 5 to 6 years where I refer to this period or view this period as a period of sedimentation of the new policy or the new model. So you have the market-led model being formalized, being debated, being sorted out, being regurgitated in different papers, all the way to 2006. And beyond 2006, whatever paper you read from the 3 official sources that I have done is a repetition of the papers that was there. And interestingly, in the 2002 to 2006 period, Taliban are not there. They haven't reemerged. I think the bulk of the Taliban reemergence is the rise of the heavy footprint and the increase of soldiers that Obama did from 2008 onwards. So there's one of the interviewees that I speak to in the paper said that event converted Taliban from a terrorist group to a freedom fighter organization or movement, at least in the view of their sympathizers. So to answer that question, particularly on the security trumping economic policy, while your priority is security and other things that you're dealing with, then economic policy kind of takes a back step. I think that is true in the second half of the decade, 2009 onwards, all the way to 2021. That is true. But prior to that, there is a period of relative calm, but that triumph, the global triumph of the market approach, has this kind of dominance that you cannot question it, and there is no room for debate and discussion, and there isn't any alternative, at least from the sources that I see. Once you move forward all the way to 2016, the idea of fragility comes in a lot, and the World Bank adopts the notion that Afghanistan is a fragile state, therefore we need to look at it slightly differently, and I think it changes its vision or its view of poverty and how poverty works in Afghanistan, because it was slightly mischaracterized prior to 2014 and 2015. For example, there was this notion that the cause of insurgency was poverty, but I think by 2015 it became very clear to the World Bank that that is not the case, because you have a lot of central Hazarajat, for example, in Afghanistan that are completely poor and they're not fighting. So the notion that working men do not rebel kind of didn't prove right in the context of Afghanistan. In terms of economic gains, I do agree with you. I think I discussed this a lot in the paper. I don't discuss it a lot in the paper, but I do refer to it here and then, that the period of aid-driven growth, which is the first decade, saw a lot of gains in Afghanistan. I actually have a table in my paper that compares GDP per capita from 1960 all the way to 2020. And I thought that's a very interesting metric you mentioned, because GDP per capita, and what I do is I adjust these prices to 2025 US dollar values. So the GDP per capita in today's prices in Afghanistan was $1,150 between 1960 to 1970. The average of it between 2002 and 2020, that's under the Republic, was 730. So it's much less compared to the state-led model. And even the second half of the state-led model from 1970 to 1978, just prior to takeover of the centrally planned economy model, that's 1,128 or so. I know there are caveats to these numbers and how you can take them at face value, but the best data we have in Afghanistan, that's actually higher in comparison. Back in 1960 to 70s, it's higher than South Asia. It's almost comparable to averages of the developing countries. Fast forward to the 2022 to 2020, this last 2 decades, the developing countries' averages are over 1,700, whereas Afghanistan's is $730. Anyway, so there are gains. I do not want to minimize the gains. There are a huge number of gains during this period. I think that's why I keep using the word suboptimal performance.
Lutfi, we have to wrap up.
Yeah.
I am reminded by our administrator.
Absolutely.
Okay.
I think I've covered all the points I could.
So there are 2 questions from the audience. One is a very simple, easier to answer. In people among your respondents, were there any significant differences in response depending on age groups? So that's one thing. Then there is another question which asks three questions, which I think are very difficult to answer in the time we have, which is what pre-existing economic and institutional factors were overlooked by decision makers during Afghanistan's economic transition in 2021? How did the market-led model clash with Afghanistan's historical economic governance traditions? In what ways did donor-driven aspirations influence the structure and direction of Afghanistan's economic reforms? We would have to have a huge panel discussion on this to answer that question. So let's do the easy one, and that is, were there any significant differences in terms of age of your response? I mean,
don't
people who
recall
remember the Soviet period or something like that. Yeah.
I think the short answer is that I don't remember from the top of my head, but I don't think I actually looked at that in terms of different ages, because I was talking to experts.
That's fine. You don't recall. That's fine.
Yeah.
So listen, I'm going to make a last comment, and I want to thank everyone who participated in this public lecture, and I thank Lutfi for a very interesting paper, and I thank Dr. Cox for making very, very good comments as expected. I will end by making one simple empirical point. And that is, when all of this discussion always happens about economic reform and the government should do this and that, I always ask myself the question, since this is what I did for many years, is what is the capacity of people to actually do something other than what it is that they did? And so, and what have governments done to build capacity as part of a reform program? So if you tell me, I want you to introduce a modern banking system and no one knows what that beast looks like, and you've made no effort, then this is this is designed to fail. But there's one interesting empirical point, is that there was a recent conference in South Florida where all of the key people in the United States that were dealing with Afghanistan said, you know, in the final analysis, our biggest contribution is the creation of a large number of educated people, meaning higher education. Well, if you look at all donor assistance over the whole period, 0.013% went on higher education. What higher education represented was the effort of Afghan society, exception for American University. And I think that says much about how they get things completely wrong about what to do, and how people who do economic reform don't do it in an integrated way. They don't look at human capacity with society. It's really, really frustrating, because you see that, you see paper after paper on economic reform that says you should do X, Y, Z, assuming that there is a kind of constant that is always there, and that is the human capacity to do that. All you need to do is give them some will. You remember the discussions in the former Soviet Union. Oh, you're a very educated group of people. You just need the market. The fact that these people had no clue about a market society or legal framework didn't seem to bother anyone. We have to wrap up before our administrator pulls the plug on us. Thank you very much. I think we need more of these kinds of discussions. And thank you, Michael, and thank you, Lutfi. And Lutfi, we look forward to your publications. Please look at our link page where all of these things get posted, and our newsletter. And whenever Lutfi's article comes out, it'll go on our LinkedIn page. Thank you, and take care. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Bogdan. All of it. Thanks, Lutfi. All the very best.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Cheers.